We want to build our party, and we want to do it with bold strokes to show that we're up to the challenge and we're done with business as usual. As it makes clear, there's no one reason we lost. Our message was weak. Our ground game was insufficient. We weren't inclusive. We were behind in both data and digital. And our primary and debate process needed improvement. So there's no one solution. There's a long list of them.
They call you Lady Luck, but there is room for doubt. At times you have a very unladylike way of running out.
We began this episode with a clip from Reince Priebus's speech about the 2013 Republican autopsy that tried to explain why Mitt Romney had lost the presidency. Now, it was fairly obvious to many of us why Mitt Romney had lost the presidency, but the RNC had really expected to win that election to the extent that Romney had not really put together a concession speech and did not, in fact, believe he had lost when he was told definitively that he had lost. So we're going to be coming back to this question of the autopsy. Today's news focus is on the failed Democratic autopsy of the 2024 election. I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil Young.
And this is the We're Not Dead Yet edition of the Political Junkie podcast. And Neil, you've been traveling again. You're back in Florida.
Yeah, been all over the place. Ohio, Florida, headed to Long Island for the summer. At least I'm in one time zone consistently for this week, but a little worn out.
Well, it's no wonder that you write about Republicans because you're just always mingling with Republicans.
I'm in one red state after another, although I don't know. In Ohio, I saw a lot of Sherrod Brown signs up. So, like I said, like we've talked about on the podcast, Ohio may be back in the purple category.
That's really good news, Neil. I'm going to hang on to that. Yes, I'm just back from the Philadelphia suburbs, which, of course, used to be Republican territory and are now Democratic territory. And, you know, the kind of place that is actually sort of centrist and swingy, but turned off by MAGA. So I saw there were no campaign signs up so far, but my mother had a lot to say about Donald Trump. It's her favorite topic. I won't get into it. So let's get to the news summary, Neil. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard became the most recent bowling pin and the third woman to fall in Donald Trump's cabinet. Or actually, she's the fourth woman, isn't she?
I believe so. I thought we had the third one a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, we did. So the third one was Lori Chavez Reimer, and Tulsi Gabbard is the fourth. So why did she resign, Neil? Was it because she was incompetent?
I mean, that may be part of the official announcement. Something quite sad. It's due to her husband's cancer diagnosis, and she said she would be leaving her position at the end of June. I do think, I don't think anyone's questioning her husband's diagnosis, but there's more to talk about here, I think, when it comes to Gabbard in this role and just the really, I think, ineffectiveness and also how she was sort of marginalized in this position, in large part because Trump really didn't agree with almost anything she had to say when it came to national intelligence.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, like many members of Trump's cabinet, she didn't really have any background in national intelligence.
Well,
she
that too.
was a military she was a military veteran, but it's really sort of astonishing how big the national intelligence apparatus is. And it sort of speaks to what may be a slightly conspiracist theory that Trump deliberately appointed people in these positions that would, in fact, disable them. So Gabbard spent a lot of time promoting conspiracy theories, but not too much time doing national intelligence for a variety of reasons, some of which you've cited. Who's gonna take over the DNI position, Neil?
Aaron Lucas, he's the deputy. He's going to be serving in an acting capacity until a new director of national intelligence can be approved by the Senate. But who's to say if that will even happen? Obviously, the Senate's out of town right now until midsummer, and I think there's a lot of speculation that Trump is going to use recess appointments on this one and probably for the rest of his presidency. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree. I think it's the only thing that really explains what Todd Blanche is still doing in the Attorney General's position. I mean, as the fall election comes down on the Trump administration, they have precious little time to make new appointments on their own, and now they can't even count on the Senate because there are those 3 senators who aren't coming back who are possibly going rogue. Susan Collins seems to depend in part for her popularity in Maine on opposing the president in key votes and not others. So, yeah, I would agree. I think Trump is probably going to use recess appointments for the rest of his presidency. And listeners, what that is basically you make a time-limited appointment during a period in which the Senate is not in session. And I think it's supposed to only last for 6 months, but you can serially reappoint that person.
Yep.
Yeah. So one of the things the Democrats might want to think about putting on their agenda is reforming recess appointments.
Yeah, I think, first of all, just when it comes to this one and others, I mean, I guess there's an aspect of this that is a function of timing, right? If someone steps out of their position when Senate is in recess, then that allows this to happen. But I think this, given how regularly this seems to be happening with the Trump administration, we shouldn't just imagine this is only a coincidence of timing, but that this is also a deliberate strategy. Just another way of undermining procedures and also sort of divided power and just sort of strong-arming just sort of using the presidency to accomplish what he wants sort of outside the regular system. So, I mean, I think we're very likely to see this continue, and I think it's in keeping with just sort of Trump's attack on the system.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, of course, our greatest sympathies go out to Tulsi Gabbard's husband in this time of illness. I do think it is interesting that they didn't say, what is the bone cancer he's got? I mean, that's sort of typical of politicians, is to use a tragedy like this as an opportunity to publicize the need for care around certain kinds of illnesses. And they haven't said, what is the rare bone cancer? He's a very young man.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we should assume that this is true. And I think also we can point out that this is a untrustworthy administration, and in the absence of full transparency, it's easy to be a little bit skeptical, but I don't think we should be when this is what the story is. I mean, let's hope that he's getting the treatment he needs and that he can fully recover.
Yes, totally agree on that, Neil. So let's move to the next news item. In April, a new super PAC called Lean Left filed paperwork with the FCC. But as Judd Legum reports at Popular Information, a fantastic Substack where Legum does a lot of investigative reporting, observers have picked up some peculiar spending patterns for this PAC. What are those spending patterns, Neil?
Well, it seems to only be spending money on really wackadoo candidates in swing districts. One that really was all over my radar about a week or so ago, which this woman Maureen Galindo, who's running in Texas 35, she lost that runoff, but all of a sudden she was all over my feed because she was making these just really insane anti-Semitic remarks, and saying that Zionists should be sent to internment camps. The DCC denounced this, and she was also saying that pedophiles, and I think she linked them to Zionists, should be castrated. So lots of sort of wild positions out there. She lost to her, to Johnny Garcia in that race in Texas 35, and actually lost really decisively. But now it appears that she was being backed by this PAC that clearly is a Republican-led operation, right?
Yeah, it is. And, this will feed into our news focus for today, which is the autopsy coming out of the Democratic Party. But I actually think, given how much that autopsy examined campaign financing and campaign spending, this is a really interesting little news item, because what it's saying is that money that Republicans give to, various campaign committees are then being funneled into dirty tricks operations. I think the dirty tricks operation here was not just intended to try to disable a Democratic candidacy in Texas 35, but also to tar the entire Democratic Party with anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
I believe Galindo was identified as a Democratic socialist. Is that correct?
I think that's right, but that's clearly what the strategy there was, right? Because if you saw this explode in social media, the sort of her statement and then the response was that this is what all Democrats are. And of course, she was immediately denounced by the party and lost overwhelmingly. But that's clearly the ploy that was, being launched there.
And Democrats are outraged by this, except, of course, they did the same thing in 2022. So how are we supposed to manage Democratic outrage that somebody else is doing the same dirty tricks that they are?
Right. I mean, I think this is something where they don't have necessarily the moral upper hand, or certainly they don't have completely clean hands when it comes to this issue, because in 2022 there was some backing of some really outlandish candidates in that midterm, and clearly it's something that, I don't think this is something either party is officially doing as much as it's being done through sort of affiliated PACs, if I'm remembering that history correctly in 2022, but it's obviously a tactic that's being used by both sides, and I think it's really despicable, but there's probably no way to, considering how poor our campaign finance laws are, I think this is probably something that we're going to see more of.
Yeah, we should probably do a whole episode called "In the Absence of Meaningful Campaign Finance Reform."
Yeah.
Of course,
point
no
to
one would
everything.
listen to it. Right, exactly. All right, our next news item is that yesterday, the Washington Post reported that 2 Trump appointees at the Treasury Department have been waging a campaign for over a year to create a $250 bill with Donald Trump's face on it. Neil, what is the origins of this ridiculous attempt to put Donald Trump's face on yet something else?
Well, which origin are we talking about? Are we talking about the megalomania behind all this that would lead to such a thing?
Right.
The capitulation of a party to this man's every whims? There's all that. When we come into the actual thing itself, the design has been created by a British artist. What we've seen so far, or at least the sort of prototype, is that it has this America 250 branding on it. Also, it seems to be colors of the American flag. I think that's sort of a convenient way, and I think, we've talked about this a little bit, how America 250 is a way to sort of push a lot of Trump authoritarianism forward, but to sort of disguise it in this this is just some patriotic thing that we're doing to celebrate the nation. And we talked about that in terms of the rallies that are being planned and sort of the summer festivities around it. They're trying to use it as cover to basically, allow the ongoing creep of Trump authoritarianism to continue.
Well, and you will be shocked to learn that it is against the law, actually, to put a living person on American currency. And this law originated in 1866 when a Treasury employee put his own face on a 5-cent greenback. Okay, just like think about that, a 5-cent greenback. What 5 cents must have been worth to have it turned into paper money. But then a Treasury employee who has no graphic decides to put his own face on it. So Congress prohibited further self-commemorations in 1866. And there has to be a law passed in Congress to reverse that in order for this to happen at the Treasury. I mean, I can imagine them just printing up the bills anyway and circulating without a law, but it seems unlikely that, given that a lot of other more serious legislation is lying fallow in the House of Representatives, that this bill will be passed, don't you think?
I mean, let's hope not. I think, first of all, I'm curious who's even put the bill forward. And of course, it'll be interesting to see how many votes it gets and who those are. Right. But, this obviously does nothing to help Americans who are struggling at a time of real economic challenges with inflation and rising gas prices. It certainly doesn't make us safer in a time of real, national security issues and really scary global events happening. Yet another vanity project by this man. And you have to think that even a good chunk of his supporters are being turned off by stuff like this. Also, I just want to add to this history, George Washington sort of set the precedent here when he, made it clear that he was not to be on any of the currency in when he was president during his lifetime, because he believed that was a sort of monarchical tactic or a monarchical expression. And of course he was his presidency was really all about disavowing any sort of monarchical traditions, and quite explicitly so. So I think there's a long history here that's been had some interesting chapters to it. This is certainly in keeping with what we know about Trump and even what the Republicans around him are willing to do. But I do think you're right that they don't need Congress to prove this for them to go forward with it. We'll see if they do or not.
Well, and it's also interesting to me that it's a $250 bill, which strikes me that Trump is really slipping in terms of his populism. Because who is going to walk around with $250 bills? Maybe you'll take them to Mar-a-Lago so that you can pay cash for a mag of champagne or something like that. But, most people don't even use $100 bills. The only person I know who has $100 bills is my wife, who is still a very cash-driven person. And so she'll sometimes take hundreds of dollars out of the cash machine and she asks for them in hundreds. But actually purchasing something with a $100 bill is really difficult. Right.
Yeah. I mean, yes, there's the sort of I think you're right. There's a sort of just blind spot in choosing the $250 bill as the thing you're putting your image on. And what that sort of suggests about the just falseness of his populism, and certainly how he has no thought of his base in mind with any of his actions. But even just cash itself seems like a sort of bizarre thing to want to attach yourself to, as we are increasingly in a cashless society. It's a sort of like a preoccupation with the past, and a sort of throwback sensibility that I think, we've talked about a lot. Trump really has, but it definitely seems to underscore his out-of-touchness, but sort of in multiple angles to that out-of-touchness.
Yeah, I think that's right. The populist thing to do would have been to create a $2.50 bill. Except what they would have learned from that is that you can't even buy a hamburger at McDonald's with $2.50. Right. So, but that would have been the populist thing to do. All right, finally, we have more retribution news this week. Yesterday, we saw a report that the Department of Justice had opened a perjury investigation of 82-year-old journalist E. Jean Carroll. Today, it appears that may not be true, that she is being questioned for perjury, but that the real investigation is in the funding for the litigation provided by tech billionaire Reid Hoffman, and that Hoffman is really the administration's primary target here. Tell us a little bit about E. Jean Carroll for listeners that have not been following her story, Neil.
Right. I mean, I think probably most folks remember her story, or certainly, if not her name, that she was this woman that successfully sued Trump for sexual assault. And she won, first of all, she won a $5 million judgment in her favor in 2023. And then she won another suit, which was a defamation lawsuit, a year later, and was awarded over $83 million for that suit. Both of those cases were actually then upheld on appeal. And so Trump has been sort of obsessively going after her since then. And I think that this is really interesting, the particular tactic that's being chosen now to go after this this billionaire who actually was one of the co-founders of LinkedIn, who set up this, I guess it was sort of like a nonprofit to handle her legal bills.
Yeah, exactly. And Hoffman clearly did this to get in Trump's face. There's no question. And he is practically the only tech billionaire who has not sucked up to Trump. He has remained in the opposition. So Hoffman is a very interesting character on the left, I guess we could say, or maybe even the center left. I met E. Jean Carroll a couple of years ago at a book party for Dahlia Lithwick.
Wow.
She is one of the most vivacious and interesting people there is. But part of what's very interesting about her is that she did not, in fact, come out with this education, or she did not come out with this information about the sexual assault from Trump for decades because she didn't want people to think she was a complainer or a victim. So she's actually a pretty lousy person to investigate. And she finally only came out with it when people like Dahlia and her lawyers said, what actually happened to you was rape. It was not just, a bad incident in a dressing room. So Carol is kind of an amazing person. She is also someone who I can honestly say has no fucks left to give. And what she says is, I'm 83. I'm almost dead. What else do I have to do with my time? I think the other thing that struck me about this, Neil, is I have been listening to Theo Baker's book, How to Rule the World, he's a student journalist at Stanford whose investigations into the president resulted in the president's resignation. But one of the things that Baker talks about in the book that he doesn't actually pick out as a major theme is how routinely very powerful, very wealthy people lie about everything. And it really put Trump's lies in context for me. Because Trump continues to deny that this thing with E. Jean Carroll ever happened or that he ever knew her, despite massive evidence to the contrary.
Well,
Sorry,
that's
Neil,
fast.
you're coughing.
Yes, I'm having a bit of a moment. Not because of that. I actually have not been that interested in reading the Theo Baker book for a number of reasons, but that actually fascinates me, and I think that's actually a really important observation. And I think certainly we know that to be true about Trump, but it's interesting to think about sort of wealth, power, and truthfulness, or in this case, wealth, power, and just the lack of truthfulness, and how, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear what Baker's theory of that is, and he maybe is not the right person to really put forward a theory, but I think it's an apt observation that probably holds up.
Yeah, I think Baker he's not too young to have done some wonderful, wonderful investigative reporting, but he is too young to actually have a theory.
Right.
But what he does observe is that the accumulating evidence in the case only causes the president of Stanford to create more reasons why the evidence is wrong. And what's more remarkable is that a large number of people on the board at Stanford sort of rally around him to protect these lies, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that he has falsified data and falsified papers and signed off on falsified data. And so it was just interesting to me because Trump's continued insistence that these lies are true. I've always thought of it as very unique to him, but I don't think it is. I think it's like a feature of advanced capitalism at this point. Okay, Neil, let's turn to the news focus. And today we went full on nerd and dug deeply into the Democratic National Committee's draft autopsy, otherwise known as an internal audit or a post-election review of the failure to elect Kamala Harris president in 2024. It was released by Democratic National Committee Chair Ken Martin, who himself seems to be on the ropes, and it is much delayed and very incomplete. What are some takeaways from this report, Neil?
Well, there's sort of like 5 big takeaways. I don't think we necessarily need to go through all of them. But first of all, it's really focused on the 2024 presidential race. And one of the big points it makes is that the Harris campaign never really landed any direct blows against Mr. Trump or against President Trump, and that the Harris campaign never established a consistent strategy to go after Trump and his public standing. A lot of stuff about Biden's exit, just not giving her enough time with 107 days to run a campaign. Also, a focus on that Trump attack ad against Harris about her supporting transition surgery for transgender inmates, and that very famous ad that ran sort of nonstop, particularly in key states, saying something like, Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you.
Yep. And they're still trying to run that transgender thing around James Tallarico. I mean, did you see Stephen Miller's tweet the other day in which he said that Tallarico was the first trans candidate for Senate?
Yep. They're doing lots of that.
It's really repulsive. Not that it would be repulsive for Tallarico to be trans, but the attack on his masculinity, for one thing, and also the assumption that actually being a trans senator is ridiculous and is not something that any democratic society should support. But I also want to dig a little more into the trans thing, Neil, because it seemed to me that part of what the report was saying, and they were very on the fence about this, is that actually in the face of that advertising, Kamala Harris should have retreated. Was that your impression?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, this document is really a poorly done one. I mean, there's incomplete sections. There are sort of grammatical and just copy editing issues. But there's also sort of, I think, we can talk more about this. I think there's just really some sort of poor analysis overall. I mean, some of the stuff seems just so predictable to not even really warrant observation. Other stuff like this feels maybe overblown. And so I think all of it points to a very directionless DNC, or at least a directionless chair.
Yes, which is actually interesting given the success that Democrats are having at the state and local level in the past year, and in by-elections and so on. It almost seems as if disabling the Democratic Party apparatus under Ken Martin has freed people to run the campaigns they want to run.
Well, it does suggest that. I think it's hard to really pinpoint what's at work here, because I also think there's just huge voter opposition to the Trump administration and a real, interest on the part of Americans in all sorts of different districts to voice, their opposition at the ballot box, and that may be in spite of what the DNC is doing. We've talked about that on the policy grounds, that it's not necessarily clear that voters are choosing Democrats right now because of any sort of policy or approval, or even any clear policy positions from Democratic candidates, as much as just, again, a voice of no against the sitting administration. But it definitely doesn't seem like the DNC is overseeing a grand strategy here as much as they're just benefiting from the moment. I do think, though, there is maybe an argument to be made in Martin's favor, which is that the DNC is spending a lot of money, and they're sending that money to districts and to races. And so maybe
Yes.
there is an argument to be made that that is a successful strategy that we see being carried out. I think that's what Martin would say to defend himself.
I think he would. I have also seen criticisms of Martin, who, by the way, before he became chair of the DNC, was chair of Minnesota's Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And so he has commanded operations at the state level in Minnesota and was fairly effective on that level. He seemed to have not much of a constituency in the national context. And I remember his appointment was actually quite controversial. And the sort of emphasis on, the face of the party needs to be a white man, find one. But I want to get back to money in a minute, Neil. I had two responses. One is that they should have hired you and me to write this thing.
Honestly, I was thinking the same thing. Or at least put it through ChatGPT. Come on, folks.
Right, exactly. And it's not just that it's poorly written. It's that it's full of the kinds of clunky sentences that are not uncommon in an undergraduate paper. You know, it is said that history always repeats itself. I mean, they don't say that, but there are those kinds of topic sentence in which some kind of truism is trotted out in a completely inappropriate and vague way. But there's some also very specific criticisms I had, and since you and I both write recent history, I was wondering how you responded to the assumption in this report that we still function in a democratic system that is dominated by two parties, rather than those two parties sharing power with a third party, basically, which is independence, and then each party coping with a variety of internal divisions, divergent factions, geographic differences. I mean, the assumption that these two parties are somehow just singularly duking it out between them seemed odd to me.
Yeah, it feels ahistorical in terms of, as you say, recent history, although I think even, a longer view. It also just seems so inside party thinking. So it's sort of like, what's the cause and what's the symptom here? A little bit hard to figure out, but it does seem caught in a sort of reality of its own making. And I think it calls to question if, like, the director of the DNC is the best person to put together an autopsy of the party that he's overseeing. If, like, maybe what would be better here is some sort of external audit, some, consultants brought in to do. I mean, Biden, Harris, Walz, none of them were interviewed for this. So their perspective is not included. That seems like just, again, sort of poor work in terms of putting this together. But especially when you see the Republican Party that feels so flexible and so sort of adaptive to current conditions, and who has, sort of brought in, a sort of social media angle and has sort of incorporated, fringe voices into making a sort of movement that extends beyond the sort of party structure itself. This feels really antiquated and just sort of like its head is in the sand about America in 2026.
Right. Well, and I was reading pretty quickly, so I may have missed this, but I also see no evidence that they put together focus groups of voters in the states that they needed to win in. And that struck me as odd.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what, again, the sort of takeaways feel like things that everyone already knew already. And so why did we need this big document to tell us sort of just the normal Monday morning quarterbacking that I think was done by everyone after the election? I don't see any big revelation here. And so then what is the usefulness of this at all? And also, if this is the insight that the party leaders have, then it really seems like they are doomed to manage this party, let alone to to really go on to electoral victory. And if there is, and I do think, the conditions still seem very favorable for a good showing for Democrats in the fall midterms. But I think, again, this sort of suggests it will be in spite of the party, not because of it.
I think that's right. And, just to return to your comment on the attack ads about Kamala Harris supporting state-funded gender transition, the report doesn't say what she should have done. And the implication was, well, maybe she shouldn't have been so stuck on telling the truth about what she supported and why she supported it. And she should have just thrown trans people under the bus. Maybe that would have helped. But in addition, she is blamed for neglecting the constituencies that swung to Trump, for not being a well-defined candidate, relying on anti-Trump sentiment rather than a positive message from her, and being generally responsible for an enthusiasm gap in the party. Do you think that's fair, Neil?
It feels like a lot is being sort of laid on her, even when there were so many challenges built into, again, the fact that she had 107 days to do this campaign. It sort of just was thrown together at the last minute. And certainly, I think, as the Harris camp has said pretty clearly in recent months, with no real help from the Biden team. So lots of internal challenges, and this sort of feels like insult to injury to lay everything at her feet around these things. There were big missteps on the part of the campaign, for sure. I think her not doing a televised interview until so late in the campaign, and her only sort of selectively doing that was definitely a problem. She hit a home run out of the park with the debate, but there are real big questions about the effectiveness of debates at this period in American political history. So real sort of handicaps there in terms of what this campaign did on its own. But I think a lot of this feels just like blame and not useful analysis. And certainly it doesn't feel like a real internal self-examination of the party itself in a way that actually would be helpful and would suggest, changes that need to be made. It seems like a lot of finger pointing and a lot of blaming, but what's the path forward?
Right. And no, I co-sign everything you're saying here. One of the things I did notice about Harris as a candidate that I still don't understand, and that doesn't exactly belong in the autopsy, but I wish somebody had thought about it, is that when she was in front of crowds, she was magic. Mm-hmm. And when she was in the studio, she became smaller, more cautious, more vague. And it was almost as if we had two candidates there. The one who was really sort of on the brink of defending herself in every interview setting, but then would go out in front of crowds and just be utterly magnetic. And so I think that warranted some kind of attention to media. And again, we'll talk about money in a minute, but it about what the state of play is for our media. Mm-hmm. Do we want candidates in the studio? Trump always does better in front of crowds than he does in the studio. What is the aspect of media and media consumption that is driving that? I also noted an observation in the report that having Biden leave the race helped down-ballot candidates, but it activated ticket splitters. What did you think about that?
Well, that actually was one thing that I thought, okay, this is interesting. That's an interesting and sort of useful point, because I think it sort of apparently, and I think this is true in a lot of places, that it allowed voters to sort of split their ticket. They sort of didn't feel like the Democratic candidate in their sort of local or state race was tied to Biden, but also they weren't necessarily going to support Harris. And I think it's an interesting observation, but again, what is one to do with this? What is the bigger sort of lesson here? The report doesn't suggest one. I do think one other thing that is useful about the document, although this is not the first thing to point this out, is that Harris really made an error in not differentiating herself from Biden.
Right.
And this seems right in terms of the analysis that 2024 was a change election, and she didn't present herself as a change candidate, and that was a real that hampered her with voters. That was a misreading of the moment and of what Americans wanted, and that there was sort of a built-in assumption that feelings about Trump from the past were going to continue into this election, and that she just sort of had to stay the course and get the win. But that failure to differentiate herself, to sort of create any room between her and the Biden presidency, backfired with enough voters.
Yeah, I think that's right. I did notice a big absence, well, two big absences. One is that the word racism never appears in the report, and the word race only appears in the report in this sentence. It's a sentence that cites party chair Ron Brown in 1989, which is, of course, when the Democrats have been in the wilderness for years.
Yeah.
And Ron Brown said, and Ron Brown was an African-American man, said that the party would be, quote, less about race and more about the races we win. The report suggests that the Harris campaign presumed support from people of color that she did not receive. But I would say that citation from Ron Brown also argues that some of what the Republican Party has done in reintroducing white supremacy into our political structure is that the Democrats are suggesting people back away from race as a campaign issue.
Yeah, I mean, well, it makes me want to ask a different question, which is does sexism get mentioned in the document? Because I didn't search for that term now that I'm thinking about it, now that you've raised this.
I am so glad that you raised that question. No, it does not appear. And gender only appears in relation to men and the emerging gender gap in the Democratic Party. And part of what's interesting to me about this is the phrase gender gap itself arises in the Reagan administration.
Right.
After the 1980 election, which so overwhelmingly elects Ronald Reagan, an internal audit, again, suggests that there is a huge gender gap emerging between men and women, and that women voted against Reagan in overwhelming numbers. Men voted for him. Now that concern seems to have flipped, that men are not voting in sufficient numbers, and the race is to get men to vote, and that's the emerging gender gap in the Democratic Party. But again, the solution that is being offered is not better policies, but better media targeting of men. But what's supposed to be in that media targeting, I don't know.
Right, yeah.
So I think it's troubling how this leaves Kamala Harris hanging, not just as a former presidential candidate, but as a future possibility for president or for any other office. It sort of suggests that everything about Harris was just a little too toxic for the American people, and that's just not sufficient for me.
Yeah, it certainly isn't. It's not anything that's useful or actionable, really. It feels like I said, sort of a lot of finger pointing, but one that doesn't really lead to a clear strategic path forward.
Yep.
So I think there's big questions for what's going to happen here. You said that there's a lot of pressure on Martin to get Martin out, but it's also pretty clear that nobody else wants this job. And so what does that say about just how high-ranking Democratic officials are feeling about, our operatives are feeling about their own party, and the sort of baked-in challenges of running it in this moment? I don't know. I mean, do you think Martin stays on in this role through the midterms?
I don't see it. I mean, I think they have to get him out. I actually think it would throw a jolt into the Democrat electorate if they did. He's clearly had very little to do with the victories at the state and local level. And, part of what is troubling to me about Martin is that practically the entire report is, other than the fact that the report is incomplete and in draft form and late and everything like that, is the incredibly high emphasis on money in the report. Mm-hmm. As if we will now accept the political reality that all politics is driven by money. They talk about how money was raised. They talk about how it was spent. They talk about when the money was spent, who it was spent by. There are endless numbers of tables that show the leading political consulting firms and what they spent and where they spent it and what they spent it on. And the conclusion to all of this has nothing to do with voters. What they say is leaders and stakeholders, this is page 172, leaders and stakeholders need to inquire whether these resources are being properly invested as marketing and voters change. Loyalty is not necessarily the question, but is the ecosystem moving more money into tested vehicles or legacy tactics? What's your response to that, Neil?
Well, it just seems like, on one hand, the party needs to think about strategy and how that operates. And, it requires money to build, grassroots networks, to support campaigns and all the rest. But that focus, I think, only serves to highlight what the report doesn't mention at all or barely focus on, which are issues. Right. And policies to address them. I think Paul Begala, who of course is the Clinton White House strategist, had a really, I thought, persuasive case when he sat down with NPR recently to talk about this, and he was like, there's nothing here that matters to voters. No discussion of affordability, of cost of living inflation, of the economic pocketbook issues that we know voters are highly concerned about right now. Right. And so I think, a focus on media strategy and of fundraising, those are not unimportant things, but in service of what? In service of what? Right. And I think there's almost like an existential question looming in this document, which is like, what is the party standing for and what is it fighting for? And that doesn't seem clear. And I think, that maybe allows us to think about some of these other post-election analyses that have happened throughout history.
Yes, I think that's right. And I want to get to those things because it does sort of show how a report like this has veered in the direction of marketing, of political consultants basically driving the train. And I saw a number of assertions that seemed quite questionable to me, like blaming the late arrival of funds for the 2024 loss. All they could talk about that summer after Biden left the race was the money pouring in.
Right, totally.
Yeah, and so I'm not sure what late arrival of funds means in that regard, whether they were sort of alluding to the fact that actually donors were withholding funds to try and get Biden out of the race, but they didn't say that.
Right.
And then there's this distinction they make between advertising expense and voter contact. And one of the things I did learn from this report is that, for example, the endless numbers of mailers that my mother gets at her house that have to go into the recycling every time I visit her, that's voter contact. It's not advertising.
Oh.
Which I think is really interesting because somebody knows that they can't contact my mother on the internet or on her cell phone, so they send her mail. I never get those mailers.
Right,
ever.
Right.
But then they talk about how this tsunami of money is also producing misleading polls. And I just want to quote one passage. First, every Democratic incumbent and candidate campaign must push back on partisan efforts to distort competitiveness and mislead voters. These efforts are disingenuous and relatively sophisticated. Some start by showing Democrats with an early lead, so later polls then show Republican momentum. Others drop in a flurry nearer to the close of a campaign to shape polling averages and saturate media churn. I love these phrases. By educating voters and the fair press about these efforts, Democrats can limit their coverage and enable the public to contextualize the data. But there's no mention of any legislation that would either reform campaign finance or reform elections by making these things illegal. Like, it should just be illegal to issue a fake poll.
Right. I mean, to try and work within the system only allows the system to sort of probably continue in all the ways you don't want it to, and that this is to Republicans' advantage. So, I mean, it just sort of, this feels very toothless in so many different dimensions, and hopefully, again, candidates can run their own campaigns and make clear their policies in the absence of a clear leadership on the part of the party itself. But the autopsy almost begs for another autopsy of it, and I'm not sure that's going to happen. But there's a lot of cleaning up that needs to take place.
Well, and let's talk about other kinds of autopsies that we have seen in the past. You brought that up a minute ago, Neil, and I think we've got some good stuff in front of us, because this autopsy says, basically the Republicans are always on and the Democrats only turn the tap on when there's an election. But don't worry, we have enough money to be just like the Republicans, and somehow that would be fine. It sounds like they're really not getting it, that Americans are actually tired of hearing from political consultants nonstop, and that's part of what is probably depressing turnout. But have these political autopsies, is it a recent thing? Is it an older thing? What are we looking at, Neil?
Well, I think it depends on how we frame this. I mean, if there's sort of like a commissioned autopsy by the party itself, my knowledge is that's of a more recent vintage. Famously is the 2012 one that the RNC did after Romney lost to Obama, and that was such a. I mean, the RNC made a big deal about that. Putting it out there, getting a ton of press around it, really sort of emphasizing it, and the big takeaway of that autopsy was listen, we're right on our principles and our policies. We just have a messaging problem, because especially with key demographic groups, including Hispanics, African American voters, women, and gay voters, and we need to speak to them in a tone that shows that our policies will work for them. And so that was the message of the party for a minute. That was immediately obliterated by the next presidential campaign, when Trump is the guy who wins the nomination, and he's running against every sort of recommendation that 2012 autopsy had about how to speak to voters, how to speak about those demographic groups.
Well, and part of what that autopsy was responding to was a famous thing that Mitt Romney said, and Mitt Romney is sort of one of those Republicans that every once in a while says something absolutely honest, and it is shocking to everyone. So Romney had basically said after the election, we just have to accept it that there are people in the United States who are never going to vote for us for any reason. And the Republican establishment rushed in, and of course the face of the party at that point was not just Reince Priebus, but Jeb Bush. And the assumption in the Republican Party was that Bush was going to be the next nominee of the party. And Bush goes to CPAC and speaks passionately about inclusion. Well, he has a partly Latino family.
Yeah.
He was a Florida politician. His brother was a Texas politician. I mean, if anybody knew the politics of Hispanic voting, it was the Bush family. And Jeb came out and said, no, we need these people, and we have good policies, and they will come with us. And yet Donald Trump ran hard in the other direction and won. So partly that makes me wonder, are these autopsies really worth it?
It doesn't seem like from recent examples that they are. I mean, on one hand, a party should evaluate, especially after a loss, what happened. Should they make them public? I don't know. I mean, or do they serve as a sort of way to just sort of expose a party's real weaknesses? I'm not sure, but I think it's so interesting that like Trump as the sort of non-politician candidate obviously wasn't beholden to sort of RNC conventional thinking at the time.
Right.
I think it was just such a surprise in the moment that was the sentiment of the time, and that it was a winning one. So I mean, I don't know if Trump is if there's a lot of lessons that can be extracted from the example of Trump, as much as it just is clear that he's upended sort of conventional operations both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. But are these autopsies useful? None of them have seemed to be, at least the recent examples.
Right, and they sort of ignore history in a profound way. I mean, when we're looking at 2016, we had Donald Trump, brand new to the political scene, huge media figure, brash guy, willing to say anything, a man's man kind of person. And we had Hillary Clinton, who was a blast from the past and sort of anchored a very centrist vision that was tinged with feminism. But it actually sort of seems to belie the report's assertion that Ron Brown really did it right in the 1990s, if in fact bringing a candidate who made her bones in the 1990s back onto the scene was such a terrible failure, right? Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't have a lot more thoughts about that, but I think that it's just worth asking if this is the right way of going about understanding an election loss.
Right.
And I also wonder if, like, I guess this is another question I have, is like, is the loss of the presidential race are the only thing that should be sort of autopsied afterwards? Because I don't know if were there autopsies after any of like a midterm election where, like the famous shellacking election and what was that, 2010, when the Democrats got handed such a big defeat, 2 years into the Obama administration. Did the DNC do a autopsy after that election? I don't believe they did.
No, not anything that they made public. And I think, again, what's interesting is that shellacking comes in the face of having a black president. And a black president who went up against the healthcare industry in such an aggressive way and won. The autopsy talks about the 2010 Tea Party insurgency. There's no place in which they talk about how overtly racist the attacks on Obama were. And so one of the serious gaps I see in this report is, what do you do if you have an inclusive party and you are running accomplished, sophisticated black candidates, and the country is too racist to vote for them, or in some ways too sexist? I mean, I remember canvassing in Georgia and Florida in black districts, and I was doing phone canvassing, and women were 100% between Kamala Harris, and men were extremely evasive. And I actually saw that vote slipping away in real time as men said to me things like, "It's not that I don't like her, it's that I just don't think she's tough enough to be president." And the questions about her toughness, her ability to function in a foreign policy crisis, her ability to function in the face of hostile white men would be compromised, and that they just couldn't vote for that, and they couldn't vote to support that. And it struck me that there were some extremely embedded views about women across racial groups that did not work in Kamala Harris's favor, that there was something about having a black and female candidate that really didn't work.
Yeah, and I think that just sort of, again, begs the question of why this document didn't have any exploration of how race and racism and sexism are at work and are factors here. And so is that because there's a blind spot at the top of the party to even understand those factors? Right. Or is it a concerted choice on the part of those leaders to not talk about those things because they think to voice those is, going to backfire, which only speaks to, if that's the case, how much they are lacking in bravery and boldness, and also sort of capitulating to the terms of the other party. So I don't know, but either way, it's not good that those things were not included in the party. It certainly suggests real problems of accurately assessing what all was at work in that election.
Right, and that they just seem not to have the capacity to even discuss it among themselves. I mean, they don't even talk about some disagreements. Some of us thought this, some of us thought that. So I want to talk about disagreement a little more broadly, because even though, parties have evaluated elections really since the 19th century to figure out what to do, you're right, this whole question of an autopsy emerges in 2012, suggesting that to lose the presidency represents a kind of sudden death phase of politics. But there are other insurgent documents in history that have been extremely powerful in shifting the direction of party politics. What are some of them, Neil? I
mean, I think one of the biggest ones that both of us probably have thought about a lot and written about a lot is, 1964, A Choice Not an Echo, Phyllis Schlafly's, small book that was a huge bestseller, this populist battle cry that really went after GOP establishment, and that talked about the Republican Party's failures, particularly in attending to its conservative wing, which at the time really was a wing. When you're thinking about sort of mid-century Republican Party and sort of the mainline establishment, sort of the moderate political class that dominated the party at mid-century, Schlafly really tapped into something that was like prophetic in a way, and that she understood that there was an impassioned conservative base that was fed up with Republican leadership that was, as the title said, an echo of the Democrats, and that what needed to be offered was an actually distinct, different choice, one that was, fully conservative, and that, didn't allow for Republicans to win in 1964, but it certainly set in motion a conservative revolution that was like decades long.
Yeah, and I think it's something that the Democrats need to think about in this sort of drift to the center that many of them seem to be proposing, which is that Schlafly was specifically criticizing the fact that Republicans ran primaries, and this was before primaries were as important in candidacies as they became a couple of decades later, but that the Republican Party was running primaries. There was all this enthusiasm for far more conservative candidates, and then a group of people would get together in New York City in someone's boardroom and pick Dwight Eisenhower, right? So Schlafly is writing in the context of her party having picked a presidential candidate who in fact had never voted before he ran in 1952. And that, I think, is a really telling little piece of information, that Eisenhower was chosen because he was famous, much as Donald Trump was famous. He was famous from his World War II experience and from basically running post-war Europe. But he wasn't a political person. He didn't actually have politics. And the Republican Party thought, this is the kind of person we need that will just sort of suit this bland moment. And you're right. I mean, 1964, when the party nominates Barry Goldwater, very much on the strength of Schlafly's book. I mean, there are these stories that she went to the convention in San Francisco and everybody is walking around with her book.
Yeah.
Which, okay, it's Phyllis Schlafly, but it makes all of us who have written books kind of shiver with glee. But that candidacy brings together what's going to become the new right. And so I want to sort of point our audience toward another video document that we're linking to, which is Paul Weyrach's famous challenge to the Republican Party in the fall of 1980, in which he proposes voter suppression as the tactics the Republicans need to use to come back to power, and says explicitly, I don't want everybody to vote. And he says the fewer people vote, the better Republicans do. Now, that's not a whole report, but it is, in fact, a goad from outside the party apparatus that turned out to shift over time Republican strategies, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, these two examples highlight, I think, what we've sort of been, finding our way towards, which is that, like, maybe inside operators are not the best at performing the autopsy. Certainly history suggests that these sort of outside activists might really have their finger on the pulse of where things are headed, and also might have the right sort of strategies about how candidates can win and parties can reach voters. And I don't think any either Schlafly or Weyrach's examples are one that we would want direct mirrors of from Democrats, but certainly the example of these sort of grassroots leaders and their vision and their sort of analysis and autopsy might be the ones that the Democrats need to look to really get a sense of where things actually are.
Yeah, and let's also look at 2016, because to the best of my knowledge, there was no autopsy circulated on why Hillary Clinton lost, but there was a book that was published by Donna Brazil, lifetime political consultant for the Democratic Party, who ends up in charge of the DNC after Debbie Wasserman Schultz's emails are hacked, and it turns out she said all of these horrific things about Bernie Sanders and a range of other things. So she has to step aside on the eve of the convention. But Donna Brazil's book hacks the inside story of the break-ins and breakdowns that put Donald Trump in the White House. On the one hand, emphasizes the importance of the Democratic National Committee in coordinating a 50-state strategy, and on the other hand, really pins a lot of the failures of 2016 on the Clinton campaign itself. Did you ever read that book, Neil?
I didn't. I have to say, though, post-26 election analysis really bothers me because, of course, the reason that Hillary Clinton is not in the White House is because of the Electoral College.
Right.
She won decisively with voters. And obviously that doesn't matter when you have an Electoral College, and the strategy has to be one that optimizes an Electoral College result. But I feel like that always has to be said when we talk about the 2016 election. She won the popular election by a margin that any candidate would want.
Right.
And so that just really seems consequential when thinking about what happened in 2016.
Hard agree. And then I would also say it amplifies our earlier point, which is that the DNC is in tension with the presidential campaign itself. So the presidential campaign is its own entity.
Right.
And theoretically, it coordinates with the DNC, but the DNC has absolutely no say over how money is raised, how it is spent, what it is spent on. And I remember one of the things Brazil complained about was that money was flowing into the Clinton campaign and it was not flowing into the DNC, which actually had an established 50-state strategy, whereas the Clinton campaign had an electoral college strategy that then failed because all the polling was off and a variety of things. You're right. Of course, she won the votes of the nation. And in fact, Democrats always win the majority of votes. Republicans are elected as a minority. And I don't see anything in this report that addresses that.
Yeah.
How do you actually win power if, in fact, you cannot win these states that are reliably Republican, or you cannot even make inroads into those states? How do you do that?
Yeah.
And there's one more document that I'd like to throw in here. Again, not an autopsy, but the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which created a template for governance that it promised the Trump administration would deliver. And that is the final thing I don't see in this report, is what exactly does the DNC think voters' issues are, and how do they plan to address them, and in what context? Congress, the White House, the governorship, where?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, that was Begala's point. I think, what's interesting is this Project 2025 was disavowed is probably not the right word, but was, essentially ignored and swept to the side by Trump in the campaign, right? Like, he didn't know, he'd never read it, he didn't know about it, whatever. And of course, everyone knew that whether or not he'd read it, I mean, I think everyone probably trusted that he hadn't read it, but I think everyone knew that would be the playbook if he were to win. A clear articulation of an agenda that was bold in its vision and sort of unchecked in what it wanted to bring about. And what is the Democratic equivalent of that? What is, and not even that a big developed document like that, but what are the core principles that this party stands for, and what are the policy recommendations to meet those issues? I don't know. I think that we're not likely to see any of that cohere before November. And I think it just feels like the party and its candidates are coasting on this anti-Trump sentiment that probably will, serve many of them well, but certainly doesn't, I think, build a lasting constituency and really sort of bring voters back into the fold, especially when it comes to independent voters.
100%. Now, I'm going to spring this one on you spontaneously, Neil, as our sort of last talking point on this segment, which is, if you were in charge of the DNC, what would you be organizing the fall campaign around?
Well, I think what I would be focusing around are winnable districts in swing states and really allowing those candidates to run the campaign that works for them. I do think in a way we've seen that happening, and we've talked about this in the elections we've seen so far, that we've had moderates winning in places like Virginia and Mississippi and Florida, and much more left-leaning candidates in other places. I think that sort of flexibility is one that should be reinforced and also funded. So that would be what I would do. What about you?
I think I would create a theme around marriage and family and bring absolutely every social issue, economic issue, political issue back to the question of marriage and family. And I think I would steal that from the Republicans, who are all about low birth rates, although I'm going to talk about that in our viral segment, but also low marriage rates and so on. Many of these things are tied to the economy. They are not tied to a culture that the Democratic Party has encouraged. They are not tied to wokeness. They are not tied to hatred of children and family or people being queer. I would get a selected number of issues that can be addressed through national legislation and I would tie them all back into the theme of marriage and family. Good jobs. Why do people need good jobs? So they can have children and have a decent home. Healthcare. Why do people need healthcare? Because everybody's working too many jobs to pay for their healthcare, and their children are getting sick anyway. So I would steal marriage and family from the Republicans and point out how specific legislative agendas by a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president could actually make those things happen and give people hope that, as Biden used to say, help is on the way. Or was that Al Gore? Help is on the way. Because I think the electorate needs that, and I think the cynicism of the voting public is in part being driven by the fact that it doesn't really matter who you vote for, life never gets easier.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's what I do. All right, Neil. So what do you want to go viral this week?
All right, I wanted this book that I just read to go viral. I picked it up the beginning of the week, devoured it. The book is The Art Thief, A True Story of Love, Crime, and a Dangerous Obsession by Michael Finkel. Do you know this book, Claire?
I do not.
It came out just like 2 years ago, 2024. It was like, a New York Times bestseller. It's like always on one of those like front tables at any bookstore I go to, and it has a great cover.
Yep.
And I've always sort of picked it up and finally picked it up and purchased it and then just gobbled it down. It's a fascinating true crime story about this French man, and I'm going to butcher his name, Stefan Breitweiser, who pulled off more than 200 heists, art heist at museums from sort of the late 1990s into the early 2000s, stealing artwork from museums in like broad daylight.
Wow.
Like while the museums were open. And he amassed a collection. Amassed a collection worth an estimated $2 billion.
Wow.
And this is a stunning story for two reasons. One, because again, unlike most art thieves who break into museums in these like sort of high-tech operations in the middle of the night, he was doing it like literally when museums were open. He was walking in as a museum goer and like taking a painting off the wall or a silver chalice off the display case and putting on his coat and walking out. So that was obviously a real difference from most art thieves. And unlike pretty much everyone who steals art, he was not doing it to make money. He was not reselling this,
Wow.
On sort of an underground system. He was just putting it all in his little room in this small town he lived in France, and surrounded by what ultimately added up to $2 billion worth of art. So that's just sort of this fascinating story. But one of the things I think really interesting about it is he was able to do this in large part because of just the immense numbers of museums in France, Switzerland, Belgium, which is where he sort of focused his thieving on, that were just these sort of tiny,
Yep.
museums in the middle of nowhere that happened to have like this incredible Renaissance painting or this like highly important Impressionist art, but that had no security apparatus, that were like, overseen by one old man who sort of unlocked the front door every day, and then maybe 3 or 4 people would come in, at a time, and these sort of under the radar museums, but museums that nevertheless had incredibly important works of art that were
Wow.
incredibly valuable. And I'm not sure that is the case now, right? Like this feels like very of the late 90s, when we're not living in sort of the surveillance system and the digital system that we have these days, that probably even these small museums are able to use now. So it felt like this sort of last moment in time when one could like walk into a museum and like maybe there was one security camera, but it was only pointed in one direction and you could sort of figure a way around it. I don't think that world exists anymore, but that was certainly a fascinating part about this. So it's a great read, certainly a good beach read if you want something a little bit heady, but also like a complete page turner. So again, it's called The Art Thief, and it's by Michael Finkel.
Oh, it sounds wonderful, Neil. And, it reminds me of the first time I ever did serious museum going in Paris, because my parents would march us around museums all the time. So I was sort of a not museum person. But when we went to Paris in 2007, we got one of those museum passes that lasts for 5 days, 7 days, whatever. And it means you can go into any museum that takes the pass, from the Orangerie to, French National Gallery, but also to these tiny museums. And sometimes my wife and I would split up and go off and do our different things. She would go to protests by striking school teachers.
Okay.
And I would look for another small museum, and I would find these tiny hole-in-the-wall places that were exactly as you described. But even at the big museums, what I found remarkable is that they let you get as close to the art as you wanted. Like, if you're at the Metropolitan Museum, there's a taped line, and you cannot cross that line. And if you do, an alarm goes off and the guard starts yelling at you. But they seem to believe in France, and I don't know whether this is a legacy of the French Revolution, that the art really belongs to the people. And that having this sort of close, you can go right up to a painting and practically put your nose on it if you want to.
Yeah.
And so I guess this is the flip side of having art be accessible.
Yeah.
All right, Neil. Well, I'm going to put that on my list for the summer. What I want everyone to read this week is Princeton University sociologist Paul Starr's article in the American Prospect, Stephen Miller's Impossible America, the Ethno-Nationalist Strategy for White Replenishment Won't Work. And what Starr decided to do was, instead of talking about Stephen Miller's anti-immigration agenda as solely driven by the hatred of people of color, which of course has a long history in the United States. 1898 is sort of one moment in which the United States government sort of hashes that one out. He talks about the emphasis on the falling birth rate, on falling marriage rates, as something that is driving the replacement of white people by people of color. And he points to some pretty serious policy differences that, again, were not mentioned in the autopsy, which is that Republicans believe that the white race is on the decline in Europe and the United States, and that all kinds of political measures need to be taken in order to force white babies to be born and raise the levels of whiteness in each country. And Starr coins the phrase white replenishment as the real strategy behind a lot of these immigration measures. What Starr also talks about, which I've never seen anybody mention, is immigration restriction as a way of turning people white. And the high focus on Latin America and Central American restrictions in that regard, because what Starr points out is that when immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe was restricted in 1924, what that did is create multiple generations in which there were almost no new immigrants coming into ethnic communities. And so he sort of posits that, well, in the phrase of many historians, there's a reason Irish become white. There's a reason Jews become white. And there's a reason why a lot of Latinos become white. And that the idea that one is actually white, one is not a person of color, which is so difficult for political consultants to grasp, is grounded in the length of time you actually remain in the United States and gradually cut yourself off from that home country. In a way, I think it's like an utterly specious theory, but Starr really points to the aggression against Latin American and Central American and African immigrants as a way to sort of put a full stop on the attachment of ethnic communities to the home country. So I highly recommend it, because I think the coining of this phrase, white replenishment, really sort of digs into the Trump administration's agenda and its messaging.
Yeah.
And really, Starr begins by pointing to that photograph that I think Homeland Security posted about a year and a half ago, in which there was an empty beach and a Chevrolet. It was this sort of resonant image from the 1950s. And it said, this is what America can look like again.
Yeah.
And that also points to a sort of fundamental misunderstanding of the 1950s and the whole post-war period as having essentially been a moment of white prosperity, peace, and happiness, and that's how we define history, when in fact you and I know that the civil rights movement is gathering steam during that entire time, eventually joined by a Latino rights movement, eventually joined by an Asian American, that organizing around rights for racial minorities is disrupting that white utopia even during World War II.
Absolutely.
So I really recommend this piece. It's worth reading, and I like it so much that listeners, Paul is going to be on a Facebook Live, a Substack Live with me on Monday at 1 o'clock. So you can join us and hear what Paul actually has to say about this article. So, Neil, I think we have once again reached the end, but it's a temporary stop, not a full stop.
Yeah. See you next week.
See you next week. And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Luck Be a Lady, written and performed by Frank Lesser. Copyrighted music licensed from Lichty. That's all for now. See you next week.
How nice a dame you can be. I know the way you've treated other guys you've been with. Luck be a lady with me. A lady doesn't leave her escort. It isn't fair, it isn't nice. A lady doesn't wander all over the room and blow on some other guy's dice. So let's keep the party polite. Never get out of my sight. Ooh, stick with me, baby, I'm the fella you came in with. Luck be a lady. Oh, luck be a lady. Luck be a lady tonight.